There's a family in the world that lives by a rule book no one ever publishes. You will not find it printed in any single volume. You cannot buy it, you cannot borrow it, and most of the people who follow it every day of their lives could not recite the whole thing from memory. And yet, it governs nearly everything. They do. From the words they are allowed to speak at dinner, to the planes they are permitted to board, from the food they must refuse, to the color they are obliged to pack in their suitcase whenever they leave the country. These are the rules of the British royal family, and some of them are so strange, so old, and so unbending that breaking them can do far more than embarrass a person. A few of them carry the weight of actual law. A few of them could quietly remove a person from the line of succession to the throne itself. And a few of them are so deeply woven into centuries of habit that nobody alive can remember exactly why they exist, only that they must be obeyed. Tonight we are going to walk through 15 of the strangest of these rules. And as we go, you're going to notice something. Some of them sound like superstition. Some of them sound like the kind of thing you would invent to keep a child in line. But underneath almost every one of them is a reason, and that reason usually comes down to one of three things: survival of the bloodline, protection of the institution, or the slow, heavy gravity of tradition that has been pressing down on this family for 1,000 years. So let us begin, not with the small rules, but with the one that can change the destiny of an entire nation with a single signature, or the absence of one. Imagine being told that you are not allowed to marry the person you love without first asking permission from your grandmother. Now imagine that your grandmother happens to be the queen, and that her refusal would not just hurt your feelings, but would legally erase your children from any claim to the crown, forever. This is not a story from a fairy tale. It is written into modern British law. Under the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, the first 6 people in line to the throne must obtain the monarch's consent before they are allowed to marry. If any one of them marries without that consent, they and their descendants are immediately disqualified from ever succeeding to the throne. The marriage itself remains legal in the eyes of the country. The love is real, the wedding happens, the rings are exchanged. But the door to the throne closes, quietly and permanently, and it closes not just on them, but on every child they will ever have. This rule replaced an even older and far stricter one called the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which demanded the monarch's approval for a vast, sprawling web of descendants. The modern version narrowed it down to just the 6 closest to the crown, but for those 6, the stakes could not be higher. When Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, he was within that circle, and so his grandmother's consent was formally required and formally granted, written out and sealed with the full ceremony of the state. The same thing happened when Prince William prepared to marry Kate Middleton. The official notice of approval was not a quick email or a casual nod across a room. It was a formal document, written by hand in elegant calligraphy, sealed with red wax, and decorated with custom artwork chosen to represent the bride and groom. This is what the modern world calls bureaucracy, but dressed in the robes of the medieval court. A reminder that even in the age of smartphones, the royal family still binds its most important moments in ancient ritual. Think about what that means. A grown man, a prince, a former soldier, still had to wait for a piece of paper to be signed before the most personal decision of his life could carry the full blessing of the institution he was born into. That is the first rule, and it is the one that reminds us this family does not entirely belong to itself. It belongs in a strange and ancient way to the country, and the country, through its laws and its monarch, holds a quiet veto over the most intimate corners of their lives. The second rule is one that most ordinary people would never even think about, because most ordinary people will never have a reason to. When 2 direct heirs to the throne need to travel somewhere, they are not supposed to fly on the same aircraft. The logic is grim, but it is simple. If a plane were to go down with both the king and the next king, aboard, the line of succession would be thrown into chaos in a single catastrophic moment. So tradition dictates that the heir and the heir's heir keep their distance in the sky. For years, this meant that as Prince George grew older, the day would come when he could no longer sit beside his father Prince William on a flight. That day arrives when the young prince turns 12. Before that age, special permission has often been granted by the monarch, which is why we have seen photographs of the whole young family boarding planes together. But permission is the key word. It is not a right. It is an exception to a rule that exists to make sure that no accident, no storm, no twist of fate could ever wipe out 2 generations of the crown at once. There is a darkness to that rule, a sense of the family always living with one eye on disaster. And that same shadow falls across the third rule, too. Whenever a member of the royal family travels, especially abroad, they are expected to pack a single specific item, no does no matter where they are going or how cheerful the occasion. They must bring an all-black outfit, not for fashion, not for a formal dinner, but for death. The reasoning is that if a member of the family were to die suddenly while they were away, or if an important figure in the country they are visiting were to Pass. They would need to be dressed appropriately for mourning the moment they stepped off the plane and back onto home soil. This rule was burned into royal memory by a real and painful event. When King George VI died in 1952, his daughter Elizabeth was abroad in Kenya. She had left as a princess, and she was returning as a queen. And she had no black clothing ready with her. The dark outfit she needed had to be brought to the aircraft so she could descend in mourning as the new monarch. From that moment on, the lesson was never forgotten. You always carry the color of grief with you, even when you're smiling for the cameras in the sunshine. Now let us move from the suitcase to the dinner table, because some of the strangest rules of all live in the dining room. The fourth rule concerns something you would never expect a royal to fear, and that is seafood. Members of the royal family have traditionally avoided eating shellfish, particularly when they are out in public or traveling on official duties. The reason is not snobbery, and it is not taste. It is risk. Shellfish carries a higher chance of causing food poisoning than almost anything else on a menu, and a royal who is doubled over with illness cannot perform their duties, cannot attend their engagements, cannot represent the country. So the safer choice became the standard choice, and over time it hardened into an unwritten rule. Avoid the oysters, avoid the mussels, avoid anything that could turn a state banquet into a medical emergency. The late Queen was known to follow this guidance closely, treating her own stomach as a matter of national importance, because in a sense it was. A monarch laid low by a bad plate of seafood is a monarch who cannot open parliament, cannot greet visiting heads of state, cannot carry out the dozens of duties that the entire machinery of the country depends upon. When your body is, in effect, a piece of national infrastructure, even your dinner becomes a calculated decision rather than a simple pleasure. The fifth rule is stranger still, and it takes us into the world of Christmas. Each year, when the royal family gathers for the holidays, there's a tradition that sounds almost too bizarre to be true. Every guest is weighed on a set of antique scales when they arrive, and then weighed again when they leave. The purpose is not cruelty, and it is not vanity. It is a peculiar form of hospitality that dates all the way back to the early 1900s and to King Edward VII. He wanted proof that his guests had truly enjoyed themselves over the festive days, and in his mind the proof was simple. If a guest left a few pounds heavier than they arrived, then they had eaten well, drunk well, and been properly looked after. To gain weight at a royal Christmas was not an embarrassment. It was a compliment to the host, a sign that no one had gone hungry under the royal roof. And so, more than a century later, the scales still come out, and the family still steps onto them, carrying on a tradition that turns a holiday feast into a friendly competition with H, the bathroom scale. It is the kind of ritual that perfectly captures the strangeness of royal life, a custom that began with one king's odd idea of generosity and then simply never stopped, passed down through the decades until it became as fixed a part of Christmas as the tree and the turkey. No one questions it. No one votes to abolish it. It endures for the same reason so many royal rules endure, simply because it always has. From the comfort of Christmas, we now turn to something colder and more political, because the sixth rule strips away one of the most basic freedoms that ordinary citizens take for granted. Members of the royal family are not permitted to express political opinions or to take sides in the democratic process. The monarch sits as the head of state, and in the case of the king, also as the head of the Church of England, and that position demands complete neutrality. They do not announce who they vote for. They do not endorse parties. They do not wade into the arguments that divide the nation, because the entire point of the crown is to stand above those arguments as a symbol of unity rather than a player in the fight. This is one of the most strictly maintained rules of all, and the discipline it requires is extraordinary. Imagine holding your tongue for decades, watching policy after policy rise and fall, having private thoughts you are never allowed to share. The royal family must do exactly that, year after year, because the moment they take a side, they shatter the illusion that they belong equally to everyone. There have been moments when tabloids claimed a royal had let their true feelings slip, hinting at a private opinion on some great national question, and every time, the palace has moved swiftly to deny it, sometimes forcing a newspaper to print a retraction. The neutrality has guarded that fiercely. It is not enough to simply stay quiet. The family must be seen to stay quiet, must give no one any reason to believe the crown leans one way or the other, because the entire authority of the monarchy rests on the idea that it floats above the storm of ordinary politics, untouched and unbothered, a fixed point in a country that is forever arguing with itself. The seventh rule is one that follows from the same idea of standing apart, and it concerns money in a way that astonishes most people when they first hear it. The British monarch is, by the structure of law, exempt from inheritance tax. When an ordinary wealthy person dies in the United Kingdom, a large portion of their estate, as much as 40% over a certain threshold, can be claimed by the government before their heirs ever see it. But when one monarch passes the crown and its private wealth to the next, that enormous tax does not apply in the same way. When the late Queen died and her Estate passed to King Charles, the inheritance tax that would have consumed a staggering sum, estimated in the hundreds of millions, simply did not fall upon him as it would on you or me. There's a logic to it, which is that the monarchy is not supposed to be slowly taxed out of existence one death at a time. But to an outside eye, it remains one of the most striking privileges in the entire system, a rule that quietly sets the crown apart from every other family in the land. The eighth rule pulls us back from grand matters of law and into the small, almost comical world of royal manners, and it involves a board game. According to Prince Andrew, the royal family does not play Monopoly. Not because it is forbidden by any statute, not because it carries any deep symbolic danger, but because, in his own words, it simply gets too vicious. Picture it for a moment. A family that has ruled for centuries, that has weathered wars and revolutions and scandals, sitting around a table and deciding that the one thing they cannot handle is the cutthroat property trading of a children's board game. There is something wonderfully human in that. It tells you that behind all the protocol and all the ceremony, these are still people who will argue over a tiny plastic hotel on a square of cardboard and who have learned, through experience, that some games are better left in the cupboard for the sake of family peace. The ninth rule keeps us in this lighter territory, but it reveals something about how the royals guard their own image. They are generally not supposed to give autographs. This may seem odd for people whose signatures the world would treasure, but the reasoning is rooted in security. An authentic royal signature, freely handed out, could be copied, forged, and misused on documents where it carries enormous weight. So the rule became simple: do not sign. There have been famous exceptions, moments where the human instinct to comfort overruled the protocol. King Charles, when he was still a prince, once broke this rule for victims of devastating floods, taking a piece of paper and signing it with a careful note, because in that moment, kindness mattered more than caution. But these moments are rare precisely because the rule is real. The signature of a future king is not just a name, it is a thing of power, and power must be protected, even down to the simple act of putting pen to paper for an admiring stranger. Closely tied to this is the 10th rule, which belongs entirely to the modern age. The royal family is generally discouraged from taking selfies with members of the public. In a world where almost every person carries a camera in their pocket, and every encounter can become a photograph. In an instant, the royals have largely held the line against the selfie. Part of it is about maintaining a certain dignity and distance. Part of it is about security, since a person asking for a selfie is a person stepping in very close with a device in hand. And part of it is simply tradition adapting to new technology. The old idea that royals do not pose like ordinary celebrities now stretched to cover the smartphone. Some, like Prince William, have bent this rule on occasion, charming a schoolchild or a fan with a quick photo. But the general expectation remains: the royal family is to be met, greeted, perhaps spoken to, but not collected like a snapshot at a theme park. The 11th rule takes us deep into the strange linguistic world that surrounds the upper reaches of British society. And it is one of the most peculiar of them all. There are certain ordinary words that royals, and those who move in their circles, are taught never to use. The most notorious of these is the word toilet. To the traditional aristocratic ear, the word is considered jarring and improper, and the preferred term is lavatory or simply loo. But it does not stop there. A royal does not sit on a couch, they sit on a sofa. They do not relax in a living room or a lounge or a den. They retire to a sitting room or a drawing room. They do not dab on perfume. They wear a scent. This is a whole hidden vocabulary, a secret code of class that signals to those in the know exactly who belongs and who does not. To an outsider, it can sound absurd that the choice between two perfectly ordinary words could carry such weight. But within these circles, language is a kind of armor, and using the wrong word can mark a person as not quite one of them. It is worth pausing on how strange this truly is. We are not talking about crude or offensive words here. We are talking about ordinary, harmless, everyday vocabulary that millions of people use without a second thought. And yet within this world, those plain words become tiny tripwires, each one capable of revealing whether a person was raised inside the bubble or merely wandered into it. A single slip, one accidental couch instead of sofa, and the trained ear of the aristocracy hears it instantly, the way a musician hears a wrong note. It is a system designed not to communicate, but to separate, a quiet test that runs silently beneath every polite conversation. The 12th rule lives at the dinner table once again, and it is so delicate, so precise, that it borders on performance art. When a royal woman is wearing lipstick and lifts a cup or a glass to drink, she's expected to drink from the very same spot each time. The reason is simple elegance. By always returning her lips to one place on the rim, she avoids leaving a smear of color all the way around the edge of the glass, keeping it clean and presentable throughout the meal. It is the kind of detail that almost no one would ever notice if it were done wrong. And yet it is exactly the kind of detail that royal training drills into a person until it becomes second nature. Every gesture refined, every movement controlled, every small act of eating and drinking turned into something quietly graceful. It is a reminder that for this family, even the act of taking a sip of water can be governed by a rule. The 13th rule reaches all the way back into the medieval past, to a time of knights and kings and laws that have somehow never been formally erased. In the year 1337, King Edward III passed an act that restricted the wearing of fur, reserving certain furs for the highest ranks of society, such as knights and the clergy, and forbidding them to ordinary people. Echoes of these old sumptuary laws, the rules that once dictated exactly what each class was allowed to wear, still drift around the royal wardrobe centuries later. The difference is that this rule, unlike the marriage law, has been broken again and again across the generations, with royals wearing fur for warmth and for grandeur throughout history. In more recent times, attitudes have shifted dramatically, and the modern royal family has moved away from real fur in response to changing values around animal welfare. But the survival of that ancient act, lingering in the background like a ghost from the 14th century, shows just how long the threads of royal rule can stretch, connecting a king from 700 years ago to the clothing choices of today. The 14th rule concerns the careful and almost diplomatic world of gifts. The royal family receives an extraordinary number of presents from people and organizations all over the world, but they cannot simply accept whatever they please. There's a strict policy governing what may and may not be taken. The guiding principle is that no gift should ever be accepted if it would place a royal under any kind of obligation to the person giving it, because a gift that buys influence is not a gift at all, it is a transaction. Presents offered by businesses are usually declined, unless they are simple souvenirs of an official visit. For members of the public, the royals may accept modest things, flowers, food, reasonable consumables, the small tokens of affection that people bring, but there are limits, and gifts above a certain modest value generally cannot be kept personally. Every year, lists of the official gifts received are published for the public to see, an act of transparency designed to make sure that no expensive present can quietly buy a royal. Favor in the shadows. Over the years, the gifts themselves have been wonderfully strange, ranging from boxes of fresh mangoes to live animals, from a doctoral thesis to a miniature throne modeled on a famous television show, but the rule behind them is deadly serious. The crown must never appear to be for sale. In a world where influence is so often bought and traded in quiet rooms, the royal family has built an entire system of rules around the simple act of receiving a present, all to make sure that nothing they accept can ever be whispered about as a bribe in disguise. And so we come to the 15th and final rule, and it is perhaps the one that captures the spirit of the whole list better than any other, because it shows how even the strangest royal rule can be quietly rewritten when the world changes. We have spoken about the rules that protect the bloodline, and there is no rule more fundamental than the question of who gets to stand in the line of succession at all. For centuries, that line was governed by harsh and rigid principles. A son was placed ahead of an older daughter simply because he was male. Anyone who married a Roman Catholic was cast out of the succession entirely. These were not casual customs. They were the iron laws of the throne. And yet, in the year 2013, that same succession to the Crown Act swept much of it away. It declared that for those born after a certain date, the order of succession would no longer depend on gender, so that an elder daughter would now keep her place ahead of any younger brother. It removed the ancient disqualification for marrying a Catholic. In a single piece of legislation, rules that had stood for hundreds of years were dissolved, proving that even the most unbreakable royal laws are, in the end, written by human hands and can be unwritten by them too. But the story does not stop in the past, because the line of succession is still very much alive and still capable of dramatic change in our own time. Even now, there are conversations at the highest levels of government about whether certain individuals should keep their place in that line at all, with leaders across the Commonwealth, signaling their willingness to agree to changes should they be proposed. It is a powerful reminder that the rulebook we have been exploring is not a dead and dusty thing locked away in a museum. It is a living document, constantly negotiated, occasionally rewritten, and always carrying enormous consequences for the people whose entire lives are bound by it. So what do we make of all this, now that we have walked through these 15 strange and binding rules? On the surface, many of them seem ridiculous. A ban on a board game, a forbidden word for the bathroom, a careful sip from one side of a glass, a set of scales at Christmas. Taken one by one, they sound like the quirks of an eccentric household. But step back and look at them all together, and a deeper pattern emerges. Every single one of these rules, from the silliest to the most severe, exists to do one of three things: to protect the survival of the line so that the crown never falls into chaos, to protect the dignity and neutrality of the institution so that it can stand above the divisions of the nation, or to preserve the long, unbroken thread of tradition that gives the monarchy its strange and enduring power. The black outfit packed in the suitcase, the carefully separated flights, the lifelong silence on politics, the consent required before marriage. These are not merely the whims of pampered royals. They are the machinery of an institution that has survived for over 1,000 years precisely because it takes nothing for granted. To be born into this family is to be handed a life of extraordinary wealth and privilege, but it is also to be handed this invisible rulebook, and to understand from your very earliest years that you are not entirely free. You cannot always marry as you wish. You cannot always say what you think. You cannot always travel as you please, or eat what you like, or even relax over a simple board game without the weight of expectation pressing down. The gilded life comes wrapped in golden chains, and every member of this family learns to wear them, generation after generation, from the cradle to the crown. The next time you see a royal smiling and waving from a balcony or stepping gracefully from a car, remember that behind that polished image lies 1,000 quiet rules, some ancient, some modern, some sensible, and some genuinely bizarre, all of them shaping a life that looks like a dream but is governed like nothing else on earth. Because in the end, the crown is not just a symbol of power and majesty. It is a cage of rules as old as the kingdom itself, forged over 1,000 years and still binding tightly today. And the people who wear it have always known that the price of the throne is a freedom the rest of us will never have to surrender.